The next topic is succession, which you've probably heard of before. And it's the process by which ecosystems change and develop over time. That's all it really is. And it occurs naturally, but it also can occur following a disturbance, both natural or human caused. So sometimes we'll talk about succession after a storm comes through, succession after people cut down all the trees. Both of the changes that occur in the ecosystem after those disturbances are called succession. Many species can be characterized as early successional or late successional, and that just describes when they come in during the process of succession. So let's say, imagine that there is a field that a farmer stops plowing and it's just left there. Some shrubs will come in early on, different grasses will come in. Those are early successional species, the ones that take hold first. Late successional species might be like trees. So as it develops into a forest, it takes a really long time, but it becomes this stable ecosystem as a forest. But the trees can only grow after the other stages have already been there. Some species really do well on disturbance, and these are disturbance adapted species. So they're species that can live somewhere even after repeated disturbances come. So if there's a place that gets lots of storms, these are species that come back every time there's a storm. If a species can't deal with disturbance well, it'll get knocked down every time there's a storm that comes through, and it may not be able to come back. Human activities can interfere with natural successional processes. So grazing of livestock can eliminate late successional species, and there's lots of other things that can change how succession takes place. Classic example, if we want to talk about primary succession, is where we start with no living thing on a place at all. An exposed rock is a good example. Also, when a volcano occurs and lava just kills everything in an area, the process of life coming back to where the lava has been is primary succession. And so we can see it starts out with small things like lichens and mosses, and then they degrade the rocks a little bit and help dust from the air to accumulate, and then we start to get things like grasses and herbs, shrubs, tree seedlings, and then eventually we get early successional trees, and finally late successional trees. So only the trees that can only grow when there are already some trees present. And a lot of times we'll refer to this as a climax community, but it's very normal in ecosystems for disturbances to come through and change back and forth from these different levels. They don't necessarily stay put even without human interference. So primary succession, as I said, it's a community developing on a site unoccupied by living organisms. And so lava is a great example. And the very first colonists are called pioneer species. Secondary succession is when an existing community is disrupted and then there are changes. So my example of a farm field that is left to slowly develop into a forest, that's secondary succession because it's not completely devoid of life. Like there's already seeds in the soil, there are microbes in the soil. It's very different than lava where it was so hot that it literally killed everything that was in that area. And then a climax community is just the community that develops last and remains there the longest. And a lot of times in some areas like where we live, we would think of a forest as being a climax community in a lot of the areas in Louisiana. In other places, the climax community might be a prairie or a desert, or, there are different ones depending on the different environmental conditions in that area. So we can also talk about the differences in complexity of ecosystems and the connectedness. So complexity involves the number of different trophic levels and the number of species at each trophic level in a community. Highly interconnected communities may have many trophic levels, and diverse communities may not be complex if all the species are clustered in a few trophic levels. So just because there are a lot of species, it depends on how they're arranged as to whether it is considered complex or not. Complex interconnected communities are thought to be more stable and resilient in the face of disturbance, because if you remove one thing, there are so many other connections that the ecosystem can keep functioning. In a simpler community, if you remove something, it might really change how that ecosystem functions. These different interactions include different sorts of ways that animals affect one another. And so one thing we talk about a lot is symbiosis, and you're probably familiar with this term. And this is where two or more species live intimately together and their fates are linked. And there's a bunch of different kinds of symbiosis. A lot of people think of symbiosis as mutualism. They are not the same thing. Mutualism is a type of symbiosis. So mutualism is when both types of organisms benefit from the association. And this can be obligate or facultative. And so obligate means that both organisms have to have each other to survive, or it could be facultative, meaning that they might both benefit, but they don't have to have this relationship to survive. Good examples of mutualisms are like pollination, where a bee or another pollinator moves genetic material around plants by visiting different flowers, and they're rewarded usually with nectar from the flower. Commensalism is where one species benefits and the other one is kind of unaffected. And then parasitism is when one species benefits, the parasite, while the other is harmed, which is the host. It's similar to predation, but sometimes considered symbiosis because the way the parasite depends on its host. A lot of parasites have to have a host, and so that makes it a type of symbiosis. So you can see here, often people will use symbiosis and mutualism interchangeably. That is not correct from an ecological point of view. Symbiosis includes these three different interactions, so mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. So if you use the word symbiosis, know that you mean two species that live intimately together. You don't necessarily mean that both of them are benefiting. So here's an example of a mutualism. Coral. Coral is an animal that has an algae living inside of it, and the coral provides the algae with a home and nutrients and access to sunlight, and the algae provides the coral with carbohydrates produced by photosynthesis. This is an obligate mutualism. The coral has to have the algae to live, and we're seeing that with climate change, as the oceans are warming, this disrupts this mutualism. And so we'll talk later on more about coral bleaching, but basically the warmth causes the coral to become stressed. It spits out its algae and turns white, which is why it's called coral bleaching, because the algae provides all the color for the coral. And then if it's a really short event, it might survive, but if it lasts very long, usually those corals will die. Commensalism is very common in nature. There are millions of species form these commensal relationships. So an example, here we have a three-toed sloth, and it has algae growing on its fur. The algae doesn't really help the sloth. So the algae is benefiting by having a place to live, but the sloth isn't really hurt or helped. Other examples include like lichens that grow on trees. Most of the time they weigh very little compared to the tree, so they're not really affecting the tree. And then there's some other examples here as well. Parasitism, you guys are probably all familiar with. They can be internal or external parasites. And so we think of things like lice, ticks would be an external parasite, internal parasites like worms that disrupt your digestive system, lots of things that we think of as being gross. What's even more gross is something called a parasitoid, which is a special kind of parasitism. So normally parasites don't want to kill their host because they want to be able to keep feeding on it. If the tick killed you, it wouldn't be able to keep getting blood from you. Parasitoids are usually wasps, and they'll inject their eggs into an organism. Caterpillars are common hosts, like you can see in the picture here. And the wasp larvae will hatch out of the eggs inside the caterpillar and eat the caterpillar from the inside out while it's still alive. And they do eventually kill the host. And so parasitoids kind of break this rule of not wanting to kill your host, whereas parasitoids are basically parasites that kill their host. Another kind of weird example is called a brood parasite. And a classic example of this is the brown-headed cowbird. So you can see here, they used to follow bison herds around, and they didn't stay in one place because the bison were always moving around. So it was hard for them to have a nest. So they evolved to take advantage of other birds' nests. And so they would lay their eggs in other birds' nests, and the other birds don't know the difference. If there's an egg in their nest, they assume that it's theirs, and they take care of the chick and feed it. And here you can see this is the adult of another species that's been taking care of this brown-headed cowbird chick. And this chick is bigger than the adult. And so this adult is spending so much energy trying to feed this brown-headed cowbird chick that it has trouble raising its own young. So it can be very detrimental to the parents that end up, the non-brown-headed cowbird parents that take care of this chick. And that's called a brood parasite because they're taking over the brood. Parasites can reduce the size of host populations and alter different species interactions. And this can happen by pulling resources away from survival and reproduction. So parasites, obviously, they're taking energy away from their host. And so this is an example of some ladybugs that have a sexually transmitted mite. And you can see this shows the females from a control population and looks at the percentage of their eggs hatching successfully. And so without this mite parasite, there's pretty high hatching success for the eggs of the ladybugs. But over here, you can see that the ones that have the mites, their eggs don't do nearly as well. And a very high proportion of them have no eggs hatching successfully. And so this could have big impacts on population dynamics if there is a high rate of parasitism in a population.